Okay, so we are going to demonstrate the testing of a double check valve assembly according to the USC 10th edition procedures. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to notify the owner that I'm going to be doing the exam. I'm going to identify the assembly. It says right here on the tag that we've got a double check valve. You see there's a direction of flow arrow. It tells me the direction of flow is this way. And I'm just going to observe to see if there's anything crazy going on. And that's the preliminary steps. Okay. I'm going to use a Midwest 845 5-valve test kit. However, this test kit has the hoses attached on it, so I'm going to manage my hoses. So I don't need two of these hoses. I only need the high side hose on this test kit. So I'm going to take off the other two hoses. If I were using an old 830 test kit like this one, I would need to wrap the hoses that I don't need around the test kit. So I would wrap these two hoses around the test kit if I were using one of these older style test kits. Okay, so now that I've notified, identified, inspect, and observed, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flush the test cocks. So I'm going to flush test cock number 1, test cock number 2, test cock number 3, and test cock number 4. I have some air in the assembly. Alright, so there was some air in the assembly that you might have heard when I was flushing. I like using a sight tube, so I'm going to put my sight tube on test cock number 3. I'm going to fill my sight tube full of water. Okay, next I'm going to put my compensating valve on test cock number 2. I get in the habit of pointing the compensating valve towards shutoff valve number 1, and that'll make more sense when we start doing diagnostics. I'm going to connect my high side hose to the compensating valve. I'm going to open up test cock number 2, which will put pressure in my gauge. So if you watch the gauge, when I open up the test cock, drives the gauge to the upper end of the scale. Next, I'm going to make sure where my hose is going, but I'm going to vent the air out of the gauge by opening up my high side bleed. So I'm making sure all of the air is out of the hose and out of the test kit. Alright, and so I'm purging the test kit. I'm going to close shutoff valve number 2. I'm going to elevate the test kit so that the center line of the test gauge is even with the top of my sight tube. You may notice I'm dripping some water out of this side of the test gauge. That's fine, that's normal, no big deal. Okay, so once I've elevated, I'm going to isolate, and then next I'm going to open up test cock, and I'm going to test by opening up test cock number 3 and observe what happens. Water flows out of the test tube. My gauge starts to drop. Now remember, the minimum value on a check valve is 1 PSID, and the other thing you have to have, the conditions you have to have, is water needs to stop flowing out of the test tube and my gauge needs to stop moving. So at this point, I'm observing that the water is not rising anymore in my test tube. My gauge has stopped moving and I am at 1.8 PSID. So I have a passing value because the check valve holds tight at 1.8 psi. Minimum is 1 psid. All right, now that I've got the reading, I can set down my test kit. I'm going to close my test cocks. I'm going to open up shutoff valve number 1, and this is to repressurize the assembly. I'm going to move my test equipment down the test cock, so I'm going to put the sight tube on test cock number 4. Alright, I'm going to fill it back up full of water. Even though it's got some water in it, I'm going to fill it back up. I'm going to move my compensating valve. You can move the compensating valve and the hose together down to test cock number 3. I'm going to open test cock number 3. And again, when I open it, it's going to cause my gauge to drive my gauge up to the upper end of the scale. I'm going to purge my gauge again by opening up the high side bleed valve. So I'm going to purge, make sure that there's no air in the hose or in the gauge. And once I've purged it, I'm going to again elevate the test kit to so the center line in the test kit is even with the sight tube. I'm going to close shutoff valve number 1. And now I'm going to open test cock number 4. Water's going to come out of the sight tube. I'm going to wait for the water to stop flowing and my gauge is stabilized. Alright, it's rising just a little bit, so I'm going to wait a second. Alright, water has now stopped flowing. My gauge has stopped moving. I have a value of 2.2 psid. So I have a passing value for my number 2 check valve. So now that I have a passing value, again, minimum's 1, so that's above the minimum. I'm going to close my test cocks. I'm going to open up shutoff valve number 1. I'm going to get my customer back in service by opening shutoff valve number 2. I'm going to remove my test equipment, and I'm going to fill out my test report completely, accurately, and legibly. And that concludes the test for the double check valve assembly. You know, the other thing, I'm going to just make sure that I've got my test cocks closed completely. And now I'm done testing the double check valve assembly.